Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about expanding the capacity of your business and workforce to grow. Distracting political dynamics in the US have added emotion and volatility to an already turbulent landscape. More change is ahead, outside and inside our workplaces. We must come together. We need to devise updated solutions rapidly. We need to draw upon our internal collective intelligence. We must empathize and utilize AI. Empathetic leadership is vital to cultivate trust and cohesion, to benefit from all that our teams have to offer. Empathy helps you as a leader to support employees navigating AI's possible future effects, understand the individual challenges, and nurture a culture of adaptability and resilience. And AI is not only redesigning work, but also enabling us to examine our cognitive processes as a tool for automation and a means to expand cognitive capacity, an opportunity to reorganize business and work and amplify human potential. I'm delighted to be talking with Heather McGowan, who is the author of The Empathy Advantage and The Adaptation Advantage. She's a keynote speaker with deep experience in the future of work and a partner at Impact 11. Heather focuses on guiding leaders through the evolving landscapes of work with an emphasis on empathy as a performance driver and adaptation as an imperative. Hi, Heather. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
These are interesting times at work and beyond.
That's an understatement, yes.
So let's get started at the beginning. And you studied industrial design at RISD, which is what my cousin did and where he went. Why did you choose that and why there?
So RISD acronym, as we just discussed for Rhode Island School of Design, is never, if anyone's never heard of it,
yes.
Which I think a lot of folks haven't because it's such a small niche in the world. As a high school student, I was like many high school students where they give you kind of a short list of what they think you're good at. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was a very short list.
Okay.
And then you kind of say, what am I interested in? And again, you've been exposed to so little, you don't even know what the possibilities are.
Right.
But based upon those two things, I was interested in, but told I was potentially competent or capable at something in the field of psychology, and then something in the field of art and design. And then the art and design thing was always kind of like, well, can you really make a living out of that? And my parents were brave souls and they said, you'll figure it out.
Okay.
So with those two things, everybody said to me, oh, you should be in art therapy, because they took one word and another word that had nothing really to do with what I was ultimately interested in.
Okay.
They just picked art and therapy and put them together. And I was like, I went and looked at that and I'm like, God, I'm not interested in that at all. So I started looking for institutions where they would have a strong program in psychology and the social sciences, because I was interested in human behavior. And then also a really strong art program and design program, really. And RISD has been affiliated with Brown for like 120 years or whatever it is. And so if you go to RISD, you can take classes at Brown, and there's probably not a better place to study human behavior than at Brown University. So by some fluke and lucky stroke, I got in. It's a very hard school to get into. I found my way there. And when I got there, I was like, wow, industrial design. It is designing products and services for people. It's focusing on human behavior. It's teaching you to ask the right questions. The whole thing is not about making the product, which it is at many institutions, but at RISD, it's the process, not the product. That's what they drill into you. It's not about solving the problem. It's finding the right question and figuring out who it impacts. And that has driven my entire life.
Very much to the idea of empathy. You have to understand who it is for and how they're going to be using it. As you say, what the problem you're trying to solve for them, thinking about them in their particular situations and circumstances.
Yes, and often in ways that they don't know and they cannot articulate. And the best description of this is a friend of mine worked on the team that designed the Swiffer, the floor cleaner mop.
Yep.
Nobody asked for that product. Nobody asked for that product. They went in and their job was P&G said we need more shelf space in Walmart and Target and et cetera. So come up with a new product for cleaning.
That was it?
That was the product. So a lot of these innovation companies, and this was done at Continuum, they went in and they watched people clean their homes and they watched people, wipe down the counters and mop the floors and everything.
Right.
And one of their insights was people spend more time cleaning the mop than they do cleaning the floor. Because you've got this bucket of water and you're trying to get the crap off of it. And they were like, hey, what if you didn't have to clean the mop? And that became an aha, and that led to the Swiffer. So many products and services are designed by figuring out what the person isn't saying and isn't asking for, but struggling with. And when I make my living as a keynote speaker, I write as well, but really it's keynote speaking and I do some workshops, is figuring out what my clients, when they ask me to do a speak for them, a talk for them, what is it they're saying? What is it they're not saying? What is it that thing they need to address? And so it really has driven my entire professional career. It's been very varied.
So let us go through that a little bit, if we may. So you then dig into the whole design aspect and you become a product designer, first of all, for a wide range of children's products and then footwear design. So what was the evolution of your experiences in the commercial design world?
Yeah. So my first job was at a company called Safety First, and they're the people who made the baby on board sign that went on the back of the car. So that little novelty product, I think it launched like $7 million in sales. And from that, they realized that the baby safety market was massive and fragmented. And so they just consolidated the safety market. And from that launched basically what's called the juvenile product industry. So I designed all that kind of stuff for a few years. And then I worked for Wilson Sporting Goods and I designed tennis sneakers for a bit. And then I did some medical products. I did some other consumer products. I did some toy invention. But in those two jobs, and then in my consulting work, I was constantly asking the business questions because there's no lane for the questions. You ask all the questions.
Okay.
And I kept getting the pushback, well, you can't really ask those questions because you're not trained in business. And I was like, okay, I'll go get an MBA. And then when I was getting my MBA, I started entrepreneurship and finance. And so I kind of went on another learning journey.
So that takes you then to Meadowbrook Lane Capital and Pioneer Capital Partners. There seems to be an evolution what you're doing at those two companies. It seems to start from strategic marketing, then to being much more involved in the actual business of evaluating investments.
Right. And really, I think when I look back on it, it was really just an extension of my education. So my mentor, who's now the president of Babson, he's one of my mentors, but a prominent one, Steve Spinelli, he had a friend who had been a very successful entrepreneur, and he had this idea that the public equity markets, so stocks that you would publicly buy, are really just governed strictly by finance. And he felt like there was enough of an interest in a private capital market that was driven by ESG. So if you have an investment in a private company, you can only get that money out if they go public or if they're bought.
Sure.
Occasionally, you can get somebody to come in, do an evaluation of your share and buy you out, but that's really difficult.
Right.
So there's a lot of illiquidity in private equity, with the only two exits being acquisition or IPO. And so he had this idea of assembling those and creating another marketplace. It was sort of niche, really only for accredited investors and really driven by people who are interested in ESG. One of the major deals they did, and this was just prior to me joining them, is they wrote the social contract when Ben & Jerry's was acquired by Unilever. Because Ben & Jerry's was going to be one of the ones that helped them start this. But in the end, people had other ways of doing, putting them sort of in like a mutual fund kind of thing to make the liquidity run that way, but the drivers of it be constrained by the fund itself. So it was a really difficult but steep learning curve. And so I learned a ton from that. I think I've only applied for one or two jobs that actually existed before me. Most of my jobs came from having lunch with somebody who said they have a problem. I listen to the problem. I formulate that around what I'm interested in, what they need, what I can solve. And so from there, I got hired back at RISD to help them figure out. They had an existing Center for Design and Business, but the way they had conceived it was to teach business skills to designers rather than to bring design thinking into business. And then that mentor of mine, Steve Spinelli, became president of another university. And he said, I have an idea of bringing together a new college, 18 different existing undergraduate majors focused on innovation, design thinking, entrepreneurship.
Oh, fascinating.
Will you help me build that? So I spent 4 years doing that, and we wrote a book on that called Disrupt Together about the process. But we built that, and we ended up reorganizing the university from 6 schools to 3 integrated colleges. But the main one I focused on was the one around innovation.
Fascinating to be part of that strategic formulation process and looking at where integration is both possible and important in different ways. So that's interesting in terms of where we're going in the evolution of education and work, how things have evolved. So in that role, I see that there's a connection there with the future of work.
Yeah.
I started noticing this thing called future of work in 2015. This is earlier than that. This is up until 2012 when you have this position. I don't even know when that phrase really first started being conceptualized. What were you seeing at those very early stages of it?
I don't know who coined the term. I know Jacob Morgan had a book. His might have been 2014 or so that was called The Future of Work. One of the things I was doing when I was working for Philadelphia, I also had clients on the side. So that was kind of my deal, because I like to keep connected to industry, and that was good for them too. And what I found myself doing in that job more than anything was explaining to people why we weren't making the right workforce. And then on the corporate side, why they didn't have the right people in place, thinking the right ways and asking the right questions.
Okay.
So I spent so much of my time explaining how the world of work had changed, even the one they were in. So I could call it future work, but it was really the now of work people weren't getting for my corporate clients. And then why we were building this new college to my academic client. And then I went on and had other academic clients around this kind of the same topic. And I just kept doing these sort of talks. I would do these sort of, because I make these visual frameworks that help people understand kind of where we are, where we've been, where we're going. And that's my speaking career kind of grew out of that. It was like, I'm spending all my time just explaining things to people. Wow, this could be its own thing.
So what was it that you were seeing in education? Because there are so many issues with the current education system and how that needs to be updated, upgraded for the workplace that young people are coming into. What was happening then that you could see, and how that related to and interacted with the client work that you were doing at the same time?
Yeah. So the first major thing that I saw at Philadelphia, which is now Jefferson University, is that they thought that collaborative courses could only happen after you had an established discipline identity.
Oh,
so they said, okay, you got to take all your design courses, and then, so you have the fundamentals of design to bring to a collaboration. So I said that everybody needs like a fundamental common mindset around solving problems. And it includes, design thinking. Can you think propositionally? Can you ask, what the right question should be? Can you put the user at the center? Can you iterate business models? When you come up with a solution, can you come up with the fundamentals of how to scale that solution? And is it, financially and economically viable and sustainable for the partners with which you make that business model?
Right.
Can you use ethnographic kind of thinking so you can figure out how to test human behavior, like understand that the mop that doesn't need to be cleaned is a value, even though nobody asked for it, by observing human behavior. Yep. And then can you do basic science systems thinking so you can think about the impacts of the solutions that you provide? So biomimicry was one of the courses that they took. So everybody took these courses together, whether you started taking some of them as freshmen, some of them as a sophomore, or first year, second year, whatever. Okay. So that you're building this alongside your discipline capabilities, and you're developing relationships with people in other industries, and you have a common set of language, and it becomes sort of a transdisciplinary mindset.
And just leaping for a second or connecting it with the current situation, you're dealing with people at different stages of their education trajectory. So people who are coming in at the very early stages of learning with people who are maybe 2 or even 3 years into their discipline, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which changes how they think about things, right?
Right.
They don't all have the same understanding and experience, and that then changes the dynamics, I imagine.
Right. And the ahas came in part dealing with faculty who were very certain that you couldn't have collaboration until you had discipline skills. also, I was talking to I would talk to students, and I would talk to juniors and seniors. I said, we're building this thing.
Right.
You'll be a part of it, but you won't have the early stages of it because it's not built yet. And the student said to me, I'm a business major. I solve real business problems. How does a kid who draws for a living going to have any impact on what I do? And I thought, wow, that exactly encapsulates the problem I need to solve. So that became very helpful and very important.
How would you capture the essence of what that person might say, having done that course or being involved in that course, as to what the relevance that design student actually had for them?
The first course they took was called Integrated Design Thinking. Mm-hmm. And so we would take them to like a train station or a bus depot or some just really chaotic space.
Yeah.
And we would say, we want you to observe the space and tell us what the problems are. And they were like, these are kids coming out of high school who are saying, will this be on the test? There's no on the test. There's no right answer. You got to figure it out. You have to find the questions. You have to tell us what the questions are that you're going to answer. They were so frustrated. They were so annoyed. This is such a waste of time. I cannot believe I'm paying for this. Lowest course ratings I think they'd probably ever had coming out of that course. But Steve was brave. He was like, don't worry about it. And then when those students who graduated got in their later years more, but when they got into the workforce, I would hear from them saying, that's the most important class I ever took. It frustrated me. But when I got in the workforce, I was like, oh, I know how to get something done. I know how to find the questions everybody else is missing. I had a similar course at RISD that was similarly frustrating. Thank you, Kina Lesky, for All Without Design, by the way.
I love that. Very delayed gratification for you. I'm glad you got it.
One of the other questions you asked me about was what insights I found in education. So the first one was that you need to create connective tissue. You need to create people who can think propositionally, form questions from the very beginning. You got to get them out of the will this be on the test, right answer kind of mindset. The other thing was, and this became sort of the kernel that started the Adaptation Advantage book, was I found that everybody was still thinking in this sort of tacitly anyway, in this framework that you have education, career, retire. And that education is the first third of your life. And you pick a major and you pick an identity early in life. We ask young children what they want to be when they grow up. We ask university students to pick a major. We pick those who do not go to university to pick a trade or a track. We ask people to pick a professional identity at a relatively young age.
And what you're going to be.
With almost no experience. And then here in the U.S. in particular, sometimes the first thing we ask each other is, what do you do? Sometimes even before we ask people's names. Yeah. All this creates a set occupational identity. Some research, a few different research studies had found that when you lose your job, so any involuntary separation, so a reduction, a layoff, a RIF, a firing, whatever it may be, can be more traumatic for folks and sometimes harder to overcome than the loss of a primary relationship.
Wow.
Because you've lost everything that you've ever been told you are from a very young age. And I was like, The other thing is when we're insistent on that education, career, retire framework, we think that learning is done as soon as we are credentialed.
Right.
So I don't use the word education very often. I use the word learning. Education implies an end state of being educated. So I think, I made this framework that I used in a lot of my talks for a long time. It said, education's one band, career is another band, retirement's another band, and the path up is an escalator. So you do your education, you get on the career ladder. And it's not like that. And it hasn't been like that for a very long time.
I know. Yeah.
Learning is across the lifespan. It's continuous. Education and career overlap because... And I say it's learning, leverage, longevity. So work is leveraging your learning. Work is learning. They're blurred lines. Yep. And then the reality is we picked a retirement age. Bismarck picked a retirement age based upon life expectancy. We were never supposed to pay, Social Security or anything because people were supposed to, stop working and die 2 days later. And now we've got 30 years sometimes and we can't afford it. And it's not good for us, not just financially, but cognitively and socially to disengage.
I am frequently saying retirement is really not good for our health for all of the reasons that you're saying, and definitely not good for our savings either.
Yeah, and then actually after I did that academic work, some of the early work I did when I was doing speaking was I did a lot of talks and some consulting for AARP, which used to be the American Association of Retired People. Now it's American Association of Real Possibilities or something like that, because they realized it's not, and they realized a long time ago, it's not about retirement. It's what do you do as that last chapter, next chapter, encore chapter. They call it a lot of different things. Is how do we think about engaging in work in different ways? How do we get workplaces to be age friendly? How do we get fragments of jobs and job shares and all sorts of ways that people can still, kind of slow down or take a different, more life work integration with more life than work, but remain engaged. And we keep that kind of sage knowledge in an organization.
Exactly. And transferring it and doing the bidirectional mentorship. Very, very important. And especially now for younger people who are really looking for mentorship. And I think some of the people who can be phasing out, it can be incredibly rewarding both ways to be sharing knowledge and understanding and experience. Then you actually go to where Mark Marr is now at Swinburne University of Technology. There's the Center of New Workforce. The future of work is quite solid at that point. It's not mainstream in terms of understanding. What was the focus then in terms of the Centre of the New Workforce in Australia starting in 2019?
Yeah, so they came to me and they said, we're putting together this center to sort of understand what the future of work means and how we should think about skills and all that stuff I was covering. And they said, we'd like you to be, it was kind of professor of practice. So I wasn't teaching. It was about research and writing. Oh, okay. They wanted me to explicitly look at how do we think about tacit versus explicit knowledge? Because explicit knowledge is anything that can be written down. I could write it in a book and hand it to you. You can read the book and you have 100% of the knowledge without any human interaction. Right. When you look at that, explicit knowledge is everything that can be automated. Yeah. Whereas tacit knowledge requires human-to-human interaction. It requires experience. It learns some kinesthetic learning and some mentorship. And so we kind of spent a bit of time looking at what are the things that are explicit, what are the things that are tacit. How do we think about those things?
That's also fascinating in terms of this explicit and tacit knowledge now that we're needing to deal with AI, and also in education or learning rather, the continuum of learning, of how we need to be thinking about what knowledge we need to have as a basis, and then what we're learning from early on that we then are going to be absorbing and converting into that tacit knowledge and understanding. How do you see some of these current developments based on that work that you were doing then?
Yeah. So if I were to connect it to like what I'm thinking like right now, I've recently stumbled on a person named John Nasta who does a lot of AI in healthcare, AI in general, but AI in healthcare. And it comes from I think he might be a neurologist. Okay. I'm not entirely sure, but he says that AI is sort of the third lens into humanity. So the first lens was the telescope that allowed us to see beyond our world. We got to see beyond anything we could see and imagine with the naked eye. So way beyond our experiences. The second lens was the microscope that allowed us to see within our world. Interesting. And that this would be the third lens because it allows us to understand our thinking, kind of delve into a higher level of cognitive velocity. Oh. Because large language models, if you just take those, are how we think. I mean, our construct of the entire world is based on language. Yep. So if we have the ability to have sort of a partner that gives us a deeper view into, because it can generate things based on our thoughts, and it can be a partner that goes back and forth that helps us expand our thinking. And then from that framework, I think that what we're going to experience next is sort of two fundamental changes to our capabilities. Okay. So what can be automated is where we will atrophy. And you can see it's already happened. So I remember my first job at Safety First, I had a Rolodex in my head of every person I worked with, their phone number. And I had, a little flip phone and I could dial up everybody's phone number. It was all in my head. Yeah. I cannot remember a 7 or 10 digit phone number without a piece of paper. I just cannot anymore because we stopped doing that like 15 years ago, right? Yep. I cannot read a map. I can push GPS. There are just things where we're not, my handwriting was never good. Absolutely illegible. I went to the supermarket with my wife the other day and she's like, what does this say? I'm like, we've been married for 20 years. How do you not be able to read my handwriting? She's like, it's getting worse. So we will atrophy what we automate.
Yeah.
And we already have. And then where we augment, like with our cognitive partners, take large language models right now, we will enhance our capabilities.
Sure.
So the companies and the organizations and the folks out there who have this sort of fear of being replaced by technology, if we only use technology to replace what humans currently do, it's a race to the bottom. And if we only let humans get lazy by using, ChatGPT or cloud or whatever you're using to shortcut things we used to do, we will lose. What we need to do is, where is the ability to enhance? Where can I become better? Where can I make my organizational capacity stronger, greater, more resilient? Not simply a cost saving. A cost saving across the boards, you got 2 years if you just do it as a cost saving.
Got it.
You really ought to be looking at, how do I enhance?
Let's go back to the pandemic, which was an extraordinary catalyst, an accelerator for all these different aspects of the technology-driven change that were ongoing. Yes, economic and societal as well, but very much technology-driven, and then situationally accelerated. You write in your second book, The Empathy Advantage, about certain frameworks that you use, which I'd love to chat with you about: the Great Resignation, the Great Refusal, the Great Reshuffle, the Great Retirement, and the Great Relocation. And I was also writing my second book during that period, so I was really watching what was going on, really trying to understand what people were going through, particularly in the US. What were some of those epiphanies that you had and observations about where we are right now?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. That the five greats, I think, were, we've been through them. It's really a fundamental shift, I think, in the power structure of the workforce, which I don't think is going to change that much. Even with the recession, we have here in the U.S., we have labor shortages that will continue more or less unabated. I mean, that's what's kept the unemployment level so low, even when we've had big layoffs in tech sectors and that kind of thing. So it was a fundamental shift. The other thing was, I think nearly everybody missed that the promise and the agreement on work, the tacit agreement we've had for work, has changed. So it used to be, and this probably came from the silent generation or earlier, it really became the last promise for the boomers was, I trade my loyalty for security. Yeah. I trade my loyalty to an organization for the security of employment.
Exactly. Yeah.
That promise has been broken for many decades.
Yes.
But the organizations that are still expecting that loyalty, that yet not providing that the promise of security, have to realize they have to provide something else. And I think no generation is a monolith, but I think each generation has a set of shared experiences, and they seek, especially around work. Yeah. So I do talk about generations a bit, but my friend too. David Allison says we should talk about values, not generations. But I think there is something to talking about both.
Agreed.
I think what Gen Z is pushing for, which I think a lot of folks are on board with, is instead, I know I'm not going to get security, so I want three things. I want mission. I want to be part of an organization that's trying to do something big and hard and meaningful. I want to be part of something bigger than myself, essentially. I want meaningful work. So what I do for that mission has to be personally meaningful to me, or some portion of it. Right. And I want mentorship. Because I know that my value in learning is as important as what I'm earning, because it's what's going to be my future value. So how are you going to help me become the next best version of myself so I'm more valuable tomorrow than I was today? And I think that's the promise. But you can't do that promise without empathy. Because without empathy, you don't have connection. You don't understand your people. You don't know what they need in terms of mentorship. You don't know how to help them become intrinsically motivated, because extrinsic motivation is over. Punishments, threats, and rewards will never get people to learn at this speed, scale, and scope.
With all of those aspects in mind, you're asking people to really rethink their workforce and rethink leadership. How do you see empathy impacting how leaders manage and how they view and work with their teams wherever they may be working?
Okay. So there's, I think, probably two fundamental things there. One, we used to live in a world that was complicated. And when it was complicated, and it was linear and complicated, most leaders were leading teams of people who had skills and knowledge that they had. So they could make decisions in certainty. They could be an unquestioned expert. They could be a little bit arrogant and competitive. And that was fine. And it was actually encouraged because that's what made you a stronger leader. You drove results. Now, most leaders are leading teams of people who have skills and knowledge they do not have, at least some of them. And it may not even be within their group. So you can't lead with individual intelligence. You have to lead with collective intelligence. You cannot get collective intelligence without empathy. So that's the first piece of how we need to lead differently. And it's technology is a big driver in that and change because, a lot of folks, suddenly you've got data security and cyber analytics and AI, and you've got all this expertise on your team that you don't know any of that stuff.
Right.
It didn't even exist when you were credentialed, if you were credentialed. The other thing that I think is taking place, and this started in the pandemic, I've got some of it in the book, I've grown a lot since then, is that we're on the cusp of a once-a-century change. And it's a change in the economic drivers. So in the 1920s, it was electrification that changed everything. In the 2020s, it's going to be AI that changes everything. In the 1920s, it was a disruption in physical labor. In the 2020s, it's a disruption of cognitive labor. In the 1920s, we had the highest rate of income inequality ever in the United States. We now have about that same level again. In the 1920s, white women got the right to vote. Black women didn't get it till 1965, but we started to see a change in the gender roles. In the 2020s, we see a change around the binariness. It's now fluid between both gender and sexuality, especially with young folks and happening all around the world at almost the same rate. So it's like a global phenomenon. We also see geopolitical shift. I mean, we are highly polarized right now. We're highly polarized not because of social media, not because of any political candidate, and I don't talk about politics, I do talk about polarization, is we've been through a loneliness epidemic, and we are in the midst of a big loneliness epidemic, and that started 50 years ago. Robert Putnam wrote about it 24 years ago with Bowling Alone, is we have a breakdown in our civic engagement and social engagement.
Why was it happening before social media really rose up 2 decades ago? Just giving a little bit more of the background.
Yes. So starting in the 1970s, we stopped doing things. We lower levels of, book clubs and civic organizations and Rotary clubs. We've had a decline in church membership. So any organization from which you get community, and we get bridging capital. That means connection to people that are not maybe just unlike you. We would have these social connections. That created our social fabric. That creates trust.
Right.
So we've had a 50-year decline in that, and that was well before social media.
Right.
Then social media comes in, and it's an agitator. It is, it is driven, it is programmed to agitate us.
Right.
Our brains are shaped for that agitation now because of the loneliness. So you bring in social media, you bring in a divisive candidate or candidates, it's not just one, it's happening around the world in about the same rate. We start becoming separated. So we start saying us versus them. This has huge implications for work. Nobody wants to talk about politics at work. I don't want to talk about politics at work. So what I say to folks is, I'm originally from Boston. In Boston, we root for 2 teams, the Red Sox and whoever beats the Yankees. And that's essentially what's called effective polarization. That is saying, I don't just want the Red Sox to win. I want the Yankees to lose. I want the Yankees to be injured. I want the Yankees to have suffering. And that's what we've started to see each other, even though at the end of the day, humans have so much more in common than they have in difference. And when you do surveys and you take out the hot button things and you ask people what they care about, we care about a lot of the same stuff.
For sure.
And we need to get back to that. And the reason I say all of that is because right now the highest level of trust we have is in organizations. And it's particularly the organization you work for is the one you have the highest level of trust in. So leaders, I just wrote a piece called Leading the Day After. And I wrote it before I knew who was going to win the election because it doesn't really matter.
Right.
You've still got to lead. 47.5% of your people are going to be upset no matter who wins.
Right.
So you've got to figure out how do you bring those people together. And I think the way you bring them together is certainly aligned with the way it's been going. Why are you here? What is the mission that we do as an organization that's bigger than yourself? What do we collectively care about? You start creating some more of that bridging capital around the mission of the organization. You start, because a lot of places, work is the only place that some people have any other social connections anymore. And it doesn't matter where they work. It doesn't matter if they're remote.
There is an extraordinary lack of trust in the workplace at present. I actually think it's tied to what you were talking about earlier, the trust was created by the organization, gave you security, and you worked there for life. I didn't have to trust people. I could just trust the organization. I was safe.
Right.
Now you have to trust a person. You have to trust your manager. You know you have no job security. So that doesn't set us up well. Then we had the pandemic, and I think the lack of trust was really exposed. What you're talking about, trust is really at the core of what is going to help things improve or help ground people or have a community that they can feel safe within. We're not starting in a good place.
No, and the thing is, I think that what I encourage people to do is say, Frances Frey, who's Frances Frey, is a trust expert, and she's a Harvard Business School professor. She says trust comes down to three things: authenticity, logic, and empathy. So authenticity is, do people experience the real you? Do they feel like you're giving them the honest approach when you're delivering things to you, or are you putting on a persona? Logic is, do you have a sound theory of what you're asking people to do, ability to communicate it, a vision of where the organization is trying to go? And then do you demonstrate that you care what that work means to the individual? So it's that meaning and mentorship. You can say to folks, this job is not forever. I would be lying if I said it was.
Right.
You are here to do this project. Here's where we are on this project. I think it's time for Reid Hoffman's Tours of Duty to come in to say, you are here for 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
This is the project you'll be on. If there's a major economic disruption or something like COVID, that may change things. And we'll talk about it when it comes to that. But you are here to do this project. This is not lifetime employment. Nobody has that anymore. And by the way, the best ever, I thought, communication to a group of employees on a very hard subject was Brian Chesky's May 5th, 2020 letter to his employees, where he said, COVID hit, I have to let 25% of you go. You should be very proud of the work that you did here. We did not see this coming. It is going to upend the travel industry for the next couple of years. You built Airbnb. I'm giving you health insurance for X amount of time. Everybody's a shareholder right now. And we're going to create a network to help you get placed somewhere else. Yes. I would go back and work for Airbnb based on that letter. Yes. I mean, the building of brand loyalty there and employee feeling of connection. So I think even without the promise of security, which isn't there, it's never been there. Let's not pretend it's going to be there.
Right.
Transparency, and then creating that trust by just being straight with people you communicate with. So people stay at jobs for their bosses. So I say, don't pick a job, pick a boss.
Many leaders are trying to do their jobs, understand how AI is going to change their job, augment their job, change the different team members, what they're doing, how they're doing it. And they need to learn empathy and try and support their team members' mental health, holistic well-being. What are the elements of advice that you suggest? As part of that question, there's some research that somebody shared with me this morning that people literally fear going back to the office. 55% fear on-site work for the rest of their life more than climate change. This is about Gen Zs. 43% said they were more scared of having to work on site full time than losing a romantic relationship or getting a divorce. This is dramatic data. What are your thoughts for those middle managers who are tasked with so much right now and trying to understand and manage these younger workers?
Yeah. So first I say, let's not sugarcoat it. It has never, ever been harder to be a leader than it is right now. I mean, you're dealing with a polarized workforce. You're dealing with a mental health crisis, a loneliness epidemic, fears of technology. Pretending it's not happening isn't working. There's some recent study in the last year that people found that their job is the greatest influence on their mental health. And the person that most impacts their mental health is their boss, on par with their spouse or partner, and higher than their doctor or therapist. That's a tremendous amount of pressure to put on leaders. Yes. And I think what we need to do is give more resource to leaders. I think we need to train them we haven't trained them or help them become successful in managing a remote or hybrid workforce. So the nostalgia and calling everybody back to the office because that's the arena in which you were successful will have marginal degrees of success. Some organizations will do it. Some organizations have always been in the office. I think that we should look to the research. I think Nick Bloom's stuff is interesting to figure out what's the right thing to do, what's the fair thing to do, to optimize around that. But there's a whole host of reasons why people don't want to be in the office all the time. I mean, some of it is neurodiversity. I mean, there are some folks for which the office environment is very disruptive and hard to focus, and whether it's socially or attention span or whatever it may be. There's also, working moms. We kind of pretend that we have a caregiving infrastructure. We absolutely do not. And it disproportionately falls on women. Yep. And so we had the highest labor force participation rate we've had in a very long time when we had more flexibility. And that included and especially working moms. Yep. So I think that we really need to do is optimize for human thriving. And that is, what are the conditions under which we get the best work? What are the conditions under which we're the happiest? What are the conditions under which, and it's the purpose of a company is not to make people happy. I get that. But when people are happy, they do better work. I mean, there's a strong correlation where the best places to work are like 16% higher in financial performance than companies that aren't on that list. That's not a mistake. So I think there's a balance to strike there that really does drive performance. I know at the end of the day, it's performance. But if you look at driving performance and you don't care about human thriving, you don't care about any human suffering, you'll have short-sighted performance because you're just going to have a rotating door. So you want to, focus on striking that balance.
I love all that and believe in that 3,000%. When you're going slightly further up, or the organization, I was looking at some Business Solver research recently, which said that 35% of CEOs say that they were culturally raised not to be empathetic. What's the solution? What can be some of the ways that they can, if they acknowledge where they are, and one can imagine find that challenging? Also, that research said that they believe that they would be seen as weak if they were empathetic. What are your thoughts for them?
Travis Bradbury's research, which was in the Adaptation Advantage, found that levels of empathy increases as you started to manage people because you started to care about them. And so your level of empathy went up until you reached a certain point in the organization, which was usually around, I think, EVP and then to CEO and C-suite level, where it went down.
Interesting.
Now, it went down because you were prized for making tough decisions, right? But the other part of his research showed that the people who maintained higher levels of empathy were more successful CEOs. So we socialized, and I think it was called the psychopath checklist, where an individual went in, and there's been some research that said, 10% or sociopaths or whatever. Right. We did encourage, do you remember Al Dunlap from the 80s? Yeah. Chainsaw Al, I think it was Sunbeam. He went in and, in the merger mania, he would just slash people gleefully, ruining people's lives. And we praised people for that because it gave you great market performance. But we realized that is very short-sighted. Right. That'll only get you so far. I mean, look at some of the best leaders out there. They connect with their people on some level, because if you don't activate your people, you're not going to get the performance at the end of the day.
So what I'd like to ask to wrap up, Heather, is there is so much change going on. It is challenging. And whether somebody is a frontline worker, a high-level team member, a leader, rising leader for millennials who are rising into some boomers' places and taking over those more senior leadership roles, and for senior executives leading companies at a time like this, so much change in the workplace and outside. What are the things that they can be thinking about to be inspiring them, to help them get through this? Because the change that's ongoing is not going to stop anytime soon. It's going to be several years at minimum. What are the things that inspire you and that you talk about in order to help people be motivated and energized to move forward in the best possible way?
Sure. So JFK said in 1962 or 5, we don't go to the moon this decade because it's easy. We go because it's hard. We need to start taking longer strides and putting greater visions out there and say it's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. And not only that, but in this lifetime that we're in right now, that we share this one experience right now as humans on this planet, we've done more in the last 75 years to improve the human condition than all of recorded history. We've brought more people out of extreme global poverty. We've brought more people into literacy. We've connected 67% of the globe. We've doubled life expectancy. If we can do that, I think the next hard thing to do is help people adapt to change. And some of that, I think a big piece of it, it's not AI as much as it is, I think, the social connection. I think we've got to bridge polarization, because we're not going to be able to effectively collaborate, which is what AI is going to ask us to do. When AI assumes all the routine and predictable, what's going to be left is the collaborative exploration. Collaborative exploration works best when it's human to machine, human to human, and with people who think differently than you do because they're the ones who check your blind spots. So I think our hard thing to do is reweave our social fabric. And I think the one way you can do it is ask people how they're doing and mean it. Don't wait for fine. How are you doing? Research by Sven Hansen from the Resilience Institute finds if you acknowledge your emotional state, you have a greater, it's like a 50+% chance of having control over that change process than if you ignore it. And we've been ignoring polarization. We've been ignoring mental health. We've been ignoring loneliness, and it's not working. It doesn't mean we have to go talk about politics. I don't suggest that at all. I think we start to talk about what are our shared values. How are you doing? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you working on a project that's meaningful for you? How did I overcome adversity? Maybe I can share with you something that I did to bounce forward, not back, but forward. And I use the image of kintsugi, Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, because that's how we should think about ourselves as leaders. Authentic, chipped, broken, and shattered, more beautiful by the mending of it together, more resilient because of it, so that we can help other people do that. Because your job at work is to help people adapt to change, become the next best version of themselves. Increasing capacity is your number one job as a leader.
What a beautiful way to end. You actually gave me goosebumps. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation at very short notice. I knew this would be exactly what I needed. I wanted to share. And so really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks again so much to Heather McGowan, author of The Empathy Advantage and The Adaptation Advantage, and a keynote speaker. You can find out more about Heather on LinkedIn and go to her website, heathermcgowan.com, HeatherMcGowan.com. You can find her books, The Empathy Advantage and Adaptation Advantage, on or at your favorite retailers. Immediate action tip. To move forward together productively at work, talk with coworkers about shared values. Ask how they're doing, if they're getting enough sleep, if they're working on a project that is meaningful to them. Share experiences where you've been able to bounce forward, not back. Your job is to help your team adapt to change and become the next best version of themselves. If you find the current work environment hard to navigate, contact me for executive mentorship and effective and empathy-centered programs to enable multi-generational, distributed managers and teams up-level rapidly for modern work and be ready for the ongoing changes ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.